Some horror movies are pure fiction, but the stories you're about to hear, they really happened. A quiet man in rural Wisconsin, living in a house full of human remains. A respected historian in Russia, secretly collecting corpses and dressing them like dolls. These are not just serial killer stories. These are real-life nightmares, and you won't believe what they left behind. Welcome back to the Nocturne. Tonight we're diving into two of the most disturbing true crime cases ever recorded. They say the dead should be left to rest. But what if someone didn't just disturb them? What if they took them home? This isn't fiction. This isn't some urban legend whispered in the dark. This is the true story of Anatoly Moskvin, a man whose obsession with death led him to commit one of the most horrifying crimes in modern history. Anatoly was no ordinary man. Born in 1966 in Nizhny Novgorod, Russia, he was a gifted scholar, fluent in multiple languages, and an expert in history and folklore. He had a fascination with cemeteries, one that started when he was young. By his own account, it all began when he was 13. A group of men forced him to attend the funeral of an 11-year-old girl named Natasha Petrova. He claimed that during the ceremony, the girl's grieving mother made him kiss the corpse on the forehead. Whether or not this story was true, something inside him changed that day. Anatoly's life became consumed with the dead. He spent years walking through graveyards, studying tombstones, and collecting detailed records on the deceased. He even wrote articles about burial rituals, earning the respect of his peers. But no one knew the full extent of his obsession. For over a decade, cemeteries across Nizhny Novgorod were plagued by desecration. Graves were vandalized. Headstones were defaced. The authorities believed they were dealing with extremist groups or disturbed individuals. They never suspected a quiet, intelligent historian. But then, in 2011, police made a shocking discovery. Anatoly was arrested during an investigation into the desecration of local graves. When officers searched his apartment, they expected to find books, maybe old photographs. Instead, they found something out of a nightmare. Inside his small, cluttered home were the mummified remains of 26 girls, some as young as 3 years old. But they weren't just bodies. Anatoly had dressed them up like dolls. Their faces were covered with wax masks, painted to resemble human features. Some had buttons for eyes. Others had music boxes sewn inside their chests so they would speak when touched. He dressed them in bright clothing, decorated them with ribbons, and even threw birthday parties for them. When questioned, Anatoly claimed he wasn't a murderer. He didn't kill these children. He dug them up. He told investigators he had been waiting for science to discover a way to bring them back to life. In his mind, he was caring for them. He believed he was giving them a second chance. But the truth was far more disturbing. Anatoly kept meticulous records of the dead girls. He knew their names, their birthdays, how they had died. He spoke to them, watched cartoons with them, even posed them around his home as if they were alive. And his parents, who lived with him, never suspected a thing. They thought the dolls were just an eccentric hobby, never realizing that their son had filled their home with corpses. The case horrified the world, but despite the sheer horror of his actions, Anatoly was never sentenced to prison. Instead, he was declared mentally unfit for trial and sent to a psychiatric facility. To this day, he remains there. But the most chilling part? Authorities found a list, hundreds of names long. A list of children, their birth dates, their death dates, their burial sites. Some of them had already been taken, but many more were still in the ground, waiting. And who knows what would have happened if he hadn't been caught. If you've ever heard the term Leatherface or Buffalo Bill, you've already heard of Ed Gein, even if you didn't know it. He's the real-life inspiration behind some of the most horrifying killers in movie history. But the reality of Ed Gein's crimes is far worse than anything Hollywood could come up with. It all started in Plainfield, Wisconsin, a small, quiet town in the 1950s. The kind of place where everybody knew each other, where neighbors trusted one another, and where doors were rarely locked. But hiding in the middle of that peaceful community was a man who would soon become one of the most infamous murderers of all time. Ed Gein was always strange. He grew up under the rule of his mother, Augusta, a fanatically religious woman who saw all women as evil, except for herself, of course. She controlled every aspect of Ed's life, teaching him that the world was full of sin and corruption. She made sure he had no friends, no relationships, only her. And Ed worshipped her. Even after she died in 1945, her influence never left him. He kept the house exactly the way she had it, except for one room, her room. He left it untouched, sealed off, like a shrine. The rest of the house, though, that's where things got disturbing. November 16, 1957. A local hardware store owner named Bernice Worden disappeared. The last person seen with her? Ed Gein. When police arrived at Gein's farmhouse to question him, they found the door unlocked. What they discovered inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. There, in a shed behind the house, they found Bernice Worden's body. She had been gutted like a deer, her body strung up and mutilated. But that was just the beginning. Inside the house, investigators found a nightmare. Skulls were stacked in corners. Bowls made out of human skulls sat on shelves. Furniture, lamps, chairs, belts, all made from human skin. A box of noses, a collection of severed heads in burlap sacks, and the most disturbing discovery, a suit. A suit made of real human skin. Gein had been robbing graves for years, taking bodies to use for his crafts. But he wasn't just making household decorations. He was making a second skin. He wanted to become his mother, to wear her like a costume. The police arrested him immediately. When asked how many people he had killed, he admitted to 2 confirmed murders: Bernice Worden and a woman named Mary Hogan, a local tavern owner who had disappeared years before. But there were so many body parts in that house that authorities believed there could have been more victims. They just couldn't prove it. In court, Ed Gein was found insane. He was sent to a mental institution instead of prison, where he lived out the rest of his life until he died in 1984. But his legacy didn't die with him. His horrific crimes inspired some of the most terrifying characters in horror history. Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs, and even Norman Bates from Psycho. His story is proof that sometimes the most disturbing monsters aren't in movies. They're real, and they could be living in the house, right next to yours.